So I wanted to make this video to cover how I learn and practice PS1 games, kind of mixed with some general starter tips. This is mainly tailored to Crash and Spyro games, since that's my background, but really should extend to any PS1 games since the core feature here is a PS1 emulator. This makes practice easy, efficient, and fun when it's set up well, and it's one of the biggest reasons for my success in speedrunning. Just to cover a little bit of the more basic stuff, when you're starting out in any new speedrun or speed game, uh, it's best to just start with checking their speedrun.com profile. You'll be able to look at rules, each category, guides, and resources that'll help you along the way for whatever category you want to do. This seems pretty obvious, but it's not uncommon for people to just kind of jump into watching the record run and they miss something kind of key. You can also get splits through resources and whatnot. As well, pretty much every speed game nowadays has some Discord out there. Just a bunch of speedrunners hanging out, asking questions, whatnot. If you ever have a question, you can always just use Discord's search feature. Somebody's probably had that same question before. Specify your channel to search. Just chuck whatever you want in there. You can always just ask it as well. Worst case scenario if it's not been answered before or not clear enough. As well, it's a good idea to check pinned messages. There's usually a good number of resources there that'll help you along your way. If you don't have the means to capture your gameplay, don't let that stop you from speedrunning. There's really nothing wrong with speedrunning offline and without recording. You just don't submit to the leaderboard, especially when you're starting out and if you're not sure on if this is going to be a good hobby for you. When you are finally able to record and submit, you'll typically be ahead of the learning curve, ahead of the beginner curve, and can usually make some waves in the community. There's often also, various other category extensions. You don't just have to run the main categories. Just make sure you're following the rules. Worst case scenario, if there's like some rule in there that you just don't agree with, run the category without doing that rule and just, make sure you don't try to pass it off for that category. For learning and practicing outside of just loading the game up on console, one method is to utilize practice codes or a practice ROM if that's actually available. Spyro 1 has a very good practice ROM, which allows you to respawn gems and set like save states and all that good stuff. Spyro 2 and Spyro 3 have practice codes, which you can run on console, and they get the job done, but they're clunky, a little bit laggier, and a little bit inaccurate. The Crash games themselves are typically replayable enough to which you can just load up the normal game and be completely fine. Another method is to load up an emulator for practice. The one I recommend and the one I'm going to talk about here is DuckStation, as you can tell here. I think this is the best emulator for practice since you can tweak some of the settings to make input delay on par with what you get on console. Sometimes if you go too far, you can even get it better, which is weird. If you're unfamiliar, emulators typically have a large amount, varying amounts of input lag. So it's going to feel heavier to play something on emulator than it would be on console. Typically, I use a USB to PS2 controller adapter. So I end up actually practicing on emulator with the same controller that I run with on console. As you can see right here, they're pretty cheap. You can find them probably also on Amazon. I've been using one of these blue triangles since I started speedrunning in 2016, and it's been going strong ever since. DuckStation will do a pretty good job of telling what controller you plug into it. So I've used an analogless PS1 controller, I've used a DualShock 1, I've plugged my Brook adapter in and just used whatever controller there. It's got analog support as well, so you're pretty much set with whatever your option is. You can always just do anything that can connect to your computer as well. For input delay, right off the bat, DuckStation's pretty good about its input delay. If that's not doing it for you though, you can go into settings here and go... What I did was I messed with a couple of graphics settings. I can't remember exactly which ones. And I was able to match my console input delay there. If that fails, you can go to emulation here and mess with this runahead, try different frame amounts, and that should be able to get you pretty much dead on with what you would expect for console. It could even be better than console, so be a little bit careful with that. So when learning the games, I recommend making use of the save states that DuckStation has, or emulators in general. The save states folder is just called save states in DuckStation. And what I'll do is I'll make a game save states folder right here. And I'll have a folder for each game that I run and a folder for each level within each game. And all I have to do is, I would make a new folder here. And I would just Control A, Control C, Control V, copy and paste my save states over here. And then I could delete these and start making new save states. So your hotkeys for making and setting save states are in Settings Hotkeys, obviously. Scroll down, Save States. You can mess with them here. You can map them to your controller, which is very helpful. I like to keep them off my controller just as a kind of a mental reset thing. The other good, important one is fast forward. Just speed through little sections, like loading zones and stuff. To give it an example of my process for learning, just at a very basic level, obviously I'd be learning along from either, a tutorial or a best segment or the record. If that's on YouTube, just really quick, there are some nice little quality of life things you can do. If you have your video up and you press period or comma, you can go forward or backward a frame at a time. You can also mess with your playback speed. So sometimes you need to see something in very slow-mo, and that's very helpful there. So to give an example here, let me clear my save states. Just start fresh. And then I'll load up the game. I'll speed through the intro. You can hold down the fast forward. I'm just trying not to go too fast. And I'll try to get something right when I gain control. Excuse me. I will also try to give myself a little bit of a delay. So I'll put the save state a little bit before than I would normally. That would give me a chance to grab the controller. It's not going to be a huge deal right now. And again, if you're on controller anyways, your save state buttons, then it's going to be easier. You can mess with whatever your preferences are. Then I'll run through a segment, and if I don't like it or if I missed a gem or something, I can maybe restart the segment and try again. I like to take a few tries before I find settle on a segment. The repetition is very good, learning things at like a micro level rather than the typical like, I'm going to play through the entire level before I reset because I can't reset, and then I'm going to play through the level again. So this kind of reinforces things. I like to be pretty particular about my save states, make sure everything is as accurate as can be. I know I missed that basket. It's not the end of the world. We're going to just keep going on. And you have 20 save states to work with. You can figure out how you want to space them. Not everything has to be perfect right off the bat. Not going to be the end of the world if you want to redo them. They're very easy to redo. Yeah, I'll just keep going through here, just like so. Got that, which is nice, but maybe I want a save state right before the big trick, that proxy. So let's grab this, kind of set myself up. Maybe the camera's not ideal. I can fix that later. And then I'll go in, and now I have an easy save state for practicing this proxy. And so that'll go on through the entire level. Again, I'll be practicing things at kind of like a micro level as I'm going with each segment, trying to make my save states good. And then when I'm done, I will go into my save states folder. I'll copy them all and paste them over to my folder here so that I can just easily copy and paste them back over as needed. Don't spin your wheels too much if you are having issues with making correct save states. Sometimes certain sections will be kind of just a little bit out of your skill level for now. They might be cycle based. It might be a mini game that's really, really difficult. If you're really trying to push to make them perfect, it's going to add a little another level of stress. Sometimes it's good enough, especially when you're starting out, just have one before the challenge and have one after. You can fill in the blank as you need, as you go, and you'll gradually build up to being able to do that section properly. After you've learned a level, take some time to run through it a few times, like I mentioned, setting goals for how clean your passes are. I usually like to think about it as like graduating the level. For Spyro games, these are memorization heavy with all the gems everywhere if you're running completion categories. Crash games are typically a little bit more straightforward, but can be a little bit more punishing with deaths. So I'll try to get something, 2 or 3 passes in a row. I don't forget a gem, I don't have any sloppy movement, I don't have any deaths, and this little graduation process helps just reinforce things for you the more you do it. Before moving on, you don't really want to cram everything in at once. Typically, it's a lot more beneficial to learn things in short bursts. Just give the brain a little bit of a break. Couple that with the practice of what you just learned, solidifying that in your head. And then once you've kind of learned bigger sections, you can start to incorporate little individual level practices, obviously run against a timer. For longer games or even certain shorter games, you can do various individual world runs or warp room runs. You could even run the same level over and over 5 times in a row. That's a great way to go about it. So that's again from the learning perspective. If you are practicing or warming up, once you've made these save states, it's actually really, really easy. Rather than booting up a console, booting up, loading into a ROM or the codes, you can simply just go to your folders here, copy and paste them all in, and be like, okay, I'm going to practice the proxy to start with here. I'm going to get that a couple times, and then I'm going to move on to maybe a trickier section. Something like this. It doesn't have to be Spyro, it can also be Crash. Either one works very well here. So if I want to just jump over here to Crash. Another big advantage for these games on emulator is certain ones, especially in the Crash game department, it's going to be easier to practice late parts of levels, especially like cycle-based stuff or time trials. Load this up. All right, there we go. So a good example, some Warp 3 levels. Some later things are a little bit harder to practice, like this hangrail skip. And I literally just loaded the game up, and within like 5 seconds I was already here. It's fantastic. I can practice this over and over and over very easily. Other places in Crash 3 like the Agapus proper cycle, rather than the respawn cycle from within Agapus, that you can only really do on console without having to go through the entire level over and over and over. So a couple quick things to be careful of when you're making your save states. You want to be careful with how you set them up. So in my example setup, I set myself up like this with this camera angle to practice the Rhinoc proxy, but it's kind of an angle I wouldn't normally get in runs, and so it might not be the most ideal setup, of course. So to kind of combat that, in my normal actual save states, I set it up before this basket so that I have time to go through this little run-in and go around that corner correctly. So that's kind of one way is you can kind of put it a little bit of extra leeway beforehand to account for this. You can also just map your create save state button to your controller, so you have an easier way to do that while running. You can also sometimes get somebody else, maybe if you have that available, to hit your save state button for you as you're playing. That's something I've used before. This is also kind of a big deal for cycle-based levels. So Crash 2 comes to mind. When you're top level, you can typically play well enough to get consistent cycles. But when you're starting out, you may not be getting consistent cycles. So you want to make sure you are practicing and reacting to differing cycles for the levels that you're going to be going up against. So my Crash 2 save states all have one at the beginning of the level. If I want to vary the cycle, I can just hold my speed up for any amount of time. Now, obviously, for some of these levels that actually have a timer at the start, I can just do that randomization here with speed up before I even enter the level. I'll have another save state beforehand. So another important thing is gameplay comparison. So recording your own practice is very helpful. You can review it and see what you've done wrong or see how you've done something right even. And then comparing it to maybe a best segment or the world record run side by side, you can easily see what you do different and where you need to kind of improve. This can be a little bit of a pain doing. Some people will stream directly to their main channel. They don't particularly care. Some people will just locally record and delete the videos later so they don't, bloat up their drive. And then some people also just stream to an alt. You can find whatever works for you. Composer uses a method for gameplay comparison that I really, really like, using a pot video player. You could probably do it through other ways, but this is the one that I'm going to explain a little bit of. So here I've taken Nitrov's Sunny Villa best seg, and I'm going to use that to play alongside my own gameplay on emulator. Composer uses this for the Spyro 1 practice ROM on console, actually, and uses RetroSpy to actually use controller inputs to be mapped to a key on the keyboard to reset the player. For these purposes, know that that's a thing you can do. I'm going to do this just on emulator since that's what I normally practice on. I set these bookmarks here. I don't think I mentioned those. You can have a couple different ones. They can be kind of saved a little bit separately. You can set these using some frame advancement as well. There's different hotkeys you'll find for that. Basically, once I have one kind of set up, I can just press my hotkey to replay from that bookmark, like so. And so if I bring up Duck here and capture this properly, the way I had to do this was a little bit jank, but it's at least effective enough. I have two separate hotkeys I press at the same time. One loads the save state and one replays the video. Get on the right one here. When I had them as the same button, it was actually causing a little bit of issues. I'm sure if I played around, I could find some sort of neater workaround. But obviously, like I said, I prefer to do the save state loading on keyboard, pick up the controller and go. So this is literally all I'm doing right here, and I'm synced up. It's super nice. And I'll just record this locally, check the VOD after I'm done, and be able to very easily compare right alongside the gameplay. Of course, with those bookmarks, I can set this to start later. Maybe I want to practice just the middle section in a level or something like that. That makes it a lot easier to do. When syncing things up on emulator, you can actually pause the emulator. I use spacebar for this and load a save state, and it'll give you the first frame that you have for the save state shown and frozen right there. And you can use that to match it to your segment to get that right, just like so. If you are doing this on console, or if for some reason that's not as clean of a solution, there's also an option through OBS for render delay to help try to sync that up a little bit further. That's pretty much everything I wanted to cover here. Just make sure there's some sort of point of reference out there for efficient emulator practice that has been a great part of my success in speedrunning. I'll link everything I've covered down in the description. Quick note on DuckStation, you'll need to get your own PS1 BIOS and game ROMs in order to play with, but everything else you can pretty much just follow the links. Thanks.